background noise. Recording in progress.
So can I add one thing? Sorry.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Dealey Plaza UK June 2021 meeting. And we are delighted to welcome back Larry Hancock, who has been such a great friend of our societies all through the years. Now, he needs no introduction from me. He's addressed us many times, particularly at our annual meetings in Canterbury. He's a famous author, written over a dozen books covering things like the exploration of long-term patterns in covert action, like his book Shadow Warfare and In Denial, and also books on political assassination, such like Someone Would Have Talked, Killing King, and The Awful Grace of God, Religious Terrorism, White Supremacy, and the Unsolved Murder of Martin Luther King. So his most recent book, which you can see behind me, is Tipping Point: The Conspiracy That Murdered President John Kennedy. So without any further ado, Larry, I'm going to hand straight over to you, and thanks again for coming to join us.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks to everybody. I wish that we were all together in Canterbury again. That was wonderful and loved that, but at least I have the memory. What I thought I would do today is, because Tipping Point is available to everyone, either serialized on Mary Farrell or as a book, you know, everybody can read it at their leisure. And I'll talk about what's in it. But what I thought I would do, Tipping Point really represents the culmination of some 30 years of my research on the Kennedy assassination. So I thought I would revisit a bit of that pathway, how that research started, the books that resulted from it, why I went off in the direction that I did, and kind of set the context for Tipping Point, because the Tipping Point truly did not come out of nowhere. And there is a lot of detail and a lot of references and a lot of citations in Tipping Point that go back to my other work and other people's work as well. But the problem was, when I decided to write Tipping Point, I decided for once in my life to really focus. And for those of you who have my other books know that they range up to 500 pages. And I just decided I had to get myself under control, or I would end up with a 700-page book that nobody would ever finish. So Tipping Point was my real effort to focus down on the conspiracy, and specifically on the Dallas conspiracy. How did the attack in Dallas originate? When did it originate? Who did it originate with? And how was it carried out? So Tipping Point is focused specifically on the Dallas attack, rather than being a general JFK conspiracy book. It starts with Lee Oswald in 1962, 1963. It doesn't start with this entire history, but so that's something to set the stage for the Tipping Point as a work, is that my intent was to make it as focused as possible. The backstory for the book, which some of you may know and some may not, even though I've addressed the group before, is the first work I ever did was a book called November Patriots that I did with Connie Kritzberg. Connie, it was a docufiction book. I did the research, I did the document work, and she used that for her fiction story about the assassination. And that fiction story actually starts off in Chicago, ends up in Dallas. If you don't know Connie, Connie was a reporter in Dallas at the time of the assassination. She covered the assassination. She got a story about the assassination in the next edition of the newspaper. And as a side note, when she read it, found out that it had been slightly modified to change her quote from the doctor that she interviewed, who had told her very specifically that the shot that killed the president had come from the front. Connie and I worked together for some time. She introduced me to a lot of people, including a lady named Anna Marie Coons-Walco. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Anna Marie. She was one of the first generation researchers and built something the equivalent of the Mary Farrell document collection on her own by going into the National Archives in DC when her when she was living there. And that was her files, and her documents were a large part of where I went from there. Some of you may have a version of Someone Would Have Talked, which was my next real effort. I published it as a research manuscript, but from JFK Lancer, and a 3-ring binder, which has become kind of a collector's item now. One of the interesting things about that first research manuscript, I actually got permission to include the transcript of Noel Twyman's interview with Roy Hargraves. Roy Hargraves is assisted by Jerry Hemming's brother, who participated in the session. That transcript went into the book. Later, it had to be pulled from Someone Would Have Talked because of Noel's concern that he was going to get sued over giving permission to having it used. I ended up having an interesting talk with Hemming's brother about that exchange. That's a long story. 2006, I came out with the first edition of Someone Would Have Talked, which was a hardcover, and was really my effort to capture everything I had learned about the context of the Kennedy assassination, as I'd known it at that point after probably a decade of work. It was followed in 2010 by the paperback second edition of the book. And if you don't have the paperback edition of the book, just so you know what the difference is, what happened in the meantime, in between 2000 and 2006 and 2010, was that I managed to really have enough access to the work of the ARB. Their collections and documents had been released. We'd had time to explore them, and I had access to the work done by Doug Horn. And Doug Horn's work primarily in the areas of the medical interviews, the NPIC interviews and materials on the comments and the storyboards relating to the films, gave me what I thought was a totally different insight into what happened after the assassination. So a big part of the 2010 version deals with what I call damage control, what other people call cover up. It deals with, the next 72 hours after the assassination, and then the next 2 weeks, and the problems that all that pose for us, and how I actually conclude that a national security action covered up what was learned and known about the conspiracy in the first 72 hours. After I finished that, people would go, okay, you've done 3 versions of one book. You're going to stop now, which was reasonable. It's like, how many copies of this do you expect me to buy? Okay, so I decided I should stop that. But the question that had been raised in my mind was, how does this all come together? How did this happen? I've written hundreds of pages about all of these people, all of these persons of interest. How could this happen? And in particular, because my sense was that it had happened within the CIA and particular individuals in the CIA, how does political assassination occur in the CIA? And so I did a book called Nexus, which was a historical study of assassination in the CIA, going back to Iran, Guatemala, on through the first part of the Cold War, and basically extended that to say, here's what I think might have happened in terms of the Kennedy assassination gelling within a certain level of the CIA. And I left it at that. And I didn't really have much intention of going any further with it, because it laid out a high-level scenario. But over the next decade or more, I started doing a lot of work on national security, a lot of work on covert warfare. I learned a lot more about the people, like David Morales or Felix Rodriguez, or in any event, Tony Sforza that I'd written about in my JFK books. But then I decided there was an element that I really never had fully understand and I needed to revisit. And that was to look at covert warfare again in terms of deniability, and in particular focus in on what we had learned about the Cuba Project and JFK and Eisenhower and the Bay of Pigs. And I spent about 3 more years really digging into that and produced the book In Denial. And that really gave me a totally different mindset, because here's what happened then. And I don't know how many of you are familiar about the work, the Mary Farrell Project on cryptonyms and pseudonyms and aliases. But over that period of time, people like Bill Simpich and David Boylan and I and some others did a whole bunch of work deconstructing cryptonyms so that we could now read all of the JM Wave operations files, the Cuba Projects files, and start understanding who is really who when you read the document. And that was a revelation. And it was a revelation about who was really doing what, when, but in particular to me, it was a revelation about JFK and the Bay of Pigs. Because what I learned in doing that book is that the entire history, the mainstream history, the history book history of JFK and the Bay of Pigs is largely wrong. And the reason it is largely wrong, well, we'll get to that, but that basically comes down to Richard Bissell lying to the entire world about what really had happened, and the people in the CIA trusting him to be telling him the truth when he was not. I incorporated that, what I'd learned from all of that, and then did Tipping Point, because I thought that that had finally given me the insight to lay down a very specific chronology, timeline, who did what to whom, when, as far as when the Dallas conspiracy started. What was the tipping point? I mean, you can get a lot of people talking about how bad the president is, how bad JFK is, how dangerous, they don't like Vietnam, they don't like this, they don't like that. What forces somebody to stop just talking over drinks in a bar and swearing at them and deciding that we're actually going to kill them? And that's where I go in Tipping Point. So we'll go to the next slide and give a little bit more explanation of why I went this direction. Because as those folks who have heard me before know, I haven't, after my first decade or so, I decided I was no longer going to get mired into the details of the official record. I basically, I had learned enough from Connie, Sylvia Mayer, the Garrison Inquiry to realize basically how screwed up the official record was. That you just, there was too much wrong with it. There were too many holes. There were too many chain of evidence violations. You would drive yourself nuts. You could not go in through the front door. You couldn't solve it or approach it like you would reverse engineer a regular crime, because it had been intentionally obfuscated, mostly by taking things away and disconnecting things, as you would with a movie. All you've got to do is make sure what you don't want to be seen doesn't appear in the movie, and you tell your story, which is what the Warren Commission did. The other thing I had learned is that, based on the ARB document releases, that it was well known inside the Secret Service, inside the FBI, certainly within the Secret Service, and within the Kennedy administration itself, that there were active threats against the president during 1963, that there were active and known threats, and those threats pointed in a particular direction. In fact, we know exactly where the most dangerous threats and the most imminent threats were felt to be. And one of the reasons we know that is from both the Chicago trip and the trip to Miami and Florida in October. So bottom line, what we learned pre-assassination, what we had learned about post-assassination, and the ongoing involvement. The other thing we learned, so I don't forget it, and I do make a point of this in Tipping Point, is we learned that regardless of what J. Edgar Hoover told the FBI to do on Sunday afternoon, that official Washington, D.C., including both the FBI and in particular the CIA, absolutely was dedicated to exploring a conspiracy and was looking at a conspiracy for days and even weeks afterwards. And I find it quite compelling that we can document the fact that not only the CIA was looking for an ongoing conspiracy, the CIA actually even ordered J.M. Wave to explore a anti-Castro Cuban conspiracy and do a research onto that, which later Shackley denied under oath. But we also know from post-assassination remarks of people in the administration that they were well aware the conspiracy was an open issue and it was just not going to be talked about. So having said all that, that led me to the backdoor approach. If I can't go in the front door, if I can't look at the evidence, if I can't look at the official story, what do? I've got to bypass that. I've got to focus on stuff that I get from myself, from NARA, that other people collected. I can't rely on the Warren Commission. I can't rely on the 26 volumes. I can't rely on the Dallas police files. I've got to have stuff that I get directly, and I've got to have new sources. And most particularly, it led me to what some people would call like just jumping off the roof or going out on the edge of the limb and jumping. And that is to start looking for sources that actually had some knowledge of the conspiracy from the inside. And I will say, honestly, I spent the better part of 20 years looking at people that claimed or others claimed had some inside knowledge. I threw away most 80% of that research and ended up with, the bottom line is, if you don't see it in Tipping Point, I couldn't believe it, and I couldn't vet it, and I couldn't credit it. So that's, sometimes somebody asks me, well, like, why isn't this in here? Did you not look at that? It's kind of, yes, I did, but I couldn't go with it. And I'm pretty strict in that regard. So this might be a good point to stop and say, okay, either you've heard all this before, or if you haven't, like, any questions up to this point?
Go ahead, Bart.
Yeah, maybe I missed it, but the title, The Tipping Point, what was your inspiration and where is it coming from? And, you know, and because roughly spoken, I think Tipping Point is a continuation of Someone Would Have Talked. I mean, you're dealing with the same type of people and so forth. So the relation between Someone Would Have Talked and Tipping Point, but also how did you get that title? Do you mind telling us about that, please?
Oh, absolutely. And it is a continuation. There, and in all honesty, there's a lot of continuity in all of the books that I just mentioned. You know, you will find commonalities in all of them. The reason I settled on this is I wanted to capture the thing, the incident, the activity, as I said, that would make somebody go from just talking and threatening to making the decision to murder. You know, what mentally, psychologically, what made it imminent? Like, what, we have to do it now. There's a deadline. And that's Tipping Point to me is what pushes you over the edge. And so I selected that title specifically to draw attention to an event, an incident at a given point in time that forced these people to do this action thinking they had no choice. We have to do it now, or it's done. And as that's obvious, and not that that what I make it clear in the book, that I think what set a deadline and forced them to immediate action, and starting only in October of 1963, although that threat in general had been in existence before then, was the knowledge that the Cuban surrogates were given that JFK was entering into negotiations with Fidel Castro. The first meetings were going to be in November, and that the expectation was, because Castro had initiated the approach, that there would be a quick resolution. The groundwork had already been agreed to that. Castro had agreed to some of the terms. And the bottom line is, I believe those people, the tactical team that went to Dallas, were told that either JFK had to be eliminated or their whole hope of returning home, going back to Cuba, overthrowing Castro was doomed. And that's where tipping point comes from.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Larry, is there a relationship between your research and Albarelli's book that is continually delayed about the Dallas coup?
Good question. I have asked Alan Kent that. I have asked, I know a bit about what is in the Albarelli book, just a bit over the last several years, but I can't really answer the question because I haven't seen what's in it. He was co-authoring a book with an ex-military person. What is the name? Talked with him. Stu and I worked with him extensively. He told me what he knew about the Albarelli book, which was, as it turned out, he decided it wasn't going to link into what he did. Gary, to answer your question, from what I know so far, the only possibility is that if the Albarelli book, as I've heard it to be described, is true, it might indicate that there was actually a backup plan in play, or that there were two tracks in play, that someone had decided to set two different groups to do this, perhaps one volunteer group that I'm writing about and maybe one contract group that he was writing about. I just don't know. And I have gotten no further information on it. My understanding is it largely comes down to a single document, which is a diary that Hank obtained. I talked to Hank about it, and which he had supposedly vetted globally with dozens of historians and people that had vetted this document. But he wouldn't share any of that, and I haven't seen any of it yet, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I wonder if that document is what keeps the delay happening like 4 times now.
Well, I'll be honest, I don't see there's any reason why. That document was privately held. I don't know what publication rights Hank got to it. There are clearly some serious legal issues about that. And I do know that early on, at least one of the delays had to do with legal issues about ownership of the documents and rights and that sort of thing. So I think that's part of it. I don't know that explains all 4 of them.
Thank you.
Who, Nick?
Yeah, it's not the letter.
Sorry.
I could not hear that one.
I just said thank you.
Oh, okay. I thought there was something else that came after that was kind of very low. So, okay.
I think that was that came from Bart. I think, Larry, there was a question that his partner was asking him. So that wasn't a question for you. It's probably what you want for tea. I think that's probably what his question was. So I don't see any questions in the chat box, Larry. So do you want to continue, and then we'll
Okay.
questions later on.
All right. So kind of I set the stage for who did I finally consider worthwhile betting my 30 years on? Like, okay, who have I vetted to the extent? Who do I find internally and externally consistent? These are the people who provided some level of insight, minimal, I will say. None of these people claim to have known very much. At best, they only acknowledged involvement, and they acknowledged it to their family, a lawyer, someone, they never expected it to go public, because I will honestly say one of my criteria is if you knew something for 20 years and then published a book on it, I don't believe you. I'm sorry. Just that's my way. So these are the people that you'll find in the book. John Roselli, who volunteered to government information at government agencies, who actually tried to, I think fascinating, tried to go to Washington, D.C. as the Garrison investigation was starting and tell Washington, D.C. from Warren and Hoover and Johnson that there was a conspiracy. And they didn't want to hear it. Okay. And then in the end, he told his lawyer that, yeah, there was a conspiracy, but no, it wasn't the Castro conspiracy that he was promoting. It was one he was involved in. John Martino, whose remarks were transmitted to the HSCA by two of his close friends who he talked to only not long before his death. David Morales from two sources, plus my own discussions with his friend Ruben. Rolando Otero, found by Fonzie. Wayne January, found by Matthew Smith, who attempted to report his experiences to the FBI, found out that the FBI really didn't want to hear what he was trying to say, was more interested in whether or not they could connect him to Jack Ruby. And at that point in time, Ray January decided talking to the FBI maybe not was a good idea. So in the end, he told his full story to Matthew Smith. And I worked over some years with Matthew. I had some other volunteers with the FAA, Alan Kent. We managed to actually follow down a lot of Matthew's original information from January and take it a good deal further. And I will say that the current work that I'm doing, and which may end up in another white paper sort of thing, would be a follow-up on Wayne January's Redbird lead, which would be somewhat, with David Boylan and I are working on it, it would be somewhat equivalent to what we did with the Wheaton lead. At this point in time, I can consider January's lead to probably even be more important to the extent that we can fully understand it. William Acker, who actually immediately reported a suspect to the FBI, and the FBI had a real problem making it go away. And finally, Gene Wheaton, who just identified some people who might have been able to provide information, but who decided not to. So those are the people that I'm focused on, that I focused on at Tipping Point. One of the fascinating things for me was that I found all of their information to interrelate. I would hear something from one of them that would show up quite independently in another. And that really started convincing me, because when I hear something from one source that shows up with someone else who could possibly never have had any interaction with the first one, then I start being persuaded. So those are the people that I finally vetted and decided I would consider seriously in looking at how a scenario would come together. And one of the things that I found that they did, there was a common thread to everything. And the common thread, fascinatingly, was Cuba. And when I started stepping back, the other thing is I found these names that were all very familiar to all of us had that same common thread, but often it got lost in the discussion. People talked about Lee Oswald, but really didn't understand the depth of his interest in Cuba. Jack Ruby, his Cuban connections get downplayed. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I can't understand why in current JFK research, Jack Ruby almost disappears. It was like he was a big deal for a long time, and then everybody just forgot about him and what his role would have been and how important So I spent a lot of time on Ruby, and someone would have talked, and I returned to Ruby at length in Tipping Point. And finally, Roselli. So one of the things that struck me was that even some of the names that were familiar with us and had been tossed around for decades had a Cuban connection that related to all these other sources that I was following. And that led me to the Cuban backstory, which is where I began to exhaust people, and people stopped listening because there's just too much of it. The Cuban backstory, as a JFK researcher, the problem that I find with the Cuban backstory is a lot of people approach Cuba in regard to the assassination the way people have approached the mafia or the CIA. It's like one big lump. They don't compartmentalize it. They don't operationalize it. They throw names around that are relevant in one year that are not relevant in the next year. And they start talking about people in 1960 that are not relevant to 1963, or vice versa. They talk about people in 1963 and they have no idea what these people were doing in 1961. What the big discovery and the big find that I think that people like David Boylan and Simpich and myself have been turning up over the last 4 or 5 years is from the CIA documents, going all the way back to the Eisenhower administration, understanding how these people social networked, who reported to who went on missions with who was trusted by whom, and quite frankly, who were the experts. If you were going to pick a team to go to Dallas to kill the president, who would have the expertise to foreign infiltration and exfiltration, the shooting skills, basically the operational skill to do it? And I am not talking about John Roselli shooting out of a storm drain. No, I'm talking about guys that knew how to do this, that were trained as snipers, that were trained, that had worked with each other, that had combat experience. If you want somebody to go to Dallas and get out and make it work, and I'm in charge, I'm going to pick the guys that I sent into Cuba who got in to Cuba and out of Cuba multiple times, even at the height of the Castro regime. These are guys I want. Okay, so these are the people I talk about, and the people that we were finally able to get to. You'll find a lot of that Cuba backstory in Tipping Point, because what I really try to do is I try to take it year by year, but you will also find it in the book In Denial. And In Denial is a book about covert operations, deniable operations, and just to set the stage, In Denial talks about deniable warfare during the Cold War and compares to deniable warfare in the 21st century, and talks about how things are different, how the people that are doing deniable warfare right now, in all honesty, like the Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese, how they are doing it and how they actually co-opted a lot of the tactics that the CIA tried to use in the Cold War and are using them more effectively. Sometimes it's not hard to use them more effectively than the CIA, who could get tangled up in its shorts just doing anything. I fail to understand how they could even pay people as bureaucratic as they were. But here's where the story, and I elaborated. I talked to Bart about this because I said to fully understand Tipping Point, you really have to understand the full story of JFK and the Bay of Pigs, which I talk about in the book In Denial. And so I'll just try to give a synopsis of that here. And that is the fact, the reality of the Bay of Pigs is that the Bay of Pigs was a second Cuba project. The first Cuba project, is ordered by Eisenhower and led by Richard Bissell and Tracy Barnes, failed as of October 1960. It was dead, it was done, it didn't work, and they turned around and ended up selling a totally different kind of project and trapping the Kennedy administration into it. And when I use the word trapping, I use it in terms of career preservation, because Richard Bissell refused psychologically to admit that he had failed. He refused to admit that he had failed the first time, and then he would later refuse to admit that he had failed the second time and managed to blame it all on JFK. And that's the story I tell in Denial. If we look at the reality of the Bay of Pigs, from what we now know of operational documents, oral histories, the way we know the Bay of Pigs is that the entire landing was actually carried out at odds with what JFK had ordered. JFK issued a directive that said that it would be totally a night landing and that there would be no transports in Cuban waters, certainly not at the beachhead by daylight. Now think about this for a minute. JFK is blamed because of the airstrikes being called off. What JFK had ordered and what he was not told had not happened was that there would have been nothing, even Cuban planes that would have left would have had nothing to attack, because according to what JFK expected, all of those ships, the transports, would have been unloaded. They would have been 100 miles at sea. There was no risk. Bissell and Cabell did not want to admit to him that they had not planned it that way, and the ships were there and at risk. And that is the reason they refused to talk to him when they were offered the chance to talk to the president and argue for the daylight strike on the day of the landing to be reinstated. Just that simple. They didn't want to admit that they had not done what he had ordered. We also now know that the airstrike cancellations, the cuts in basically all the strikes before the landing, were initiated by Bissell, not JFK. What we know is that the military leaders, Hawkins and military leaders and Easterline came to Bissell and said, the plan is going to fail. And this is 3 weeks before the landing. We resign, we're quitting, it's not going to work. What you have orders to do is going to be a disaster. Unless the president orders more airstrikes, we're done. We know that Richard Bissell told them, both men have said this in writing, a report saying Richard Bissell lied to them and told him to proceed, not to resign, because he would convince JFK to escalate the airstrikes. Instead, Bissell further cut the airstrikes. He did not advise JFK of their resignations or their offer to resign. He did not brief JFK on the final assessment of the pre-landing airstrikes. When he sent those ships into the Bay of Pigs, he knew that half the Cuban Air Force was still operational. JFK was not told that. Even the warning from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, ordered by JFK to review the plan, had given a written response to Bissell and the CIA, which said, if there was a single aircraft, Cuban aircraft, hostile aircraft, operating over the beachhead at the time of the landing, it was doomed, because it was more likely than not that the ships had no real air defense. One of those ships, at least one of the ships, would be taken out. The logistics supply line for the landing was so slim that if everything wasn't landed initially, they couldn't hold the beachhead. And they ignored the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Air Staff report. JFK had issued a directive that if the landing encountered any opposition at all, there was to be a plan to re-embark the brigade and land them somewhere else at a later time. There was no plan even made for that, and nobody told them that. And he ordered that the officers of Brigade 2506 would be briefed before they sailed, the fact that there would be absolutely no American military support for the landing. The records say that briefing was done. The Cubans say that it was not. So since some of this may be a shock to you, I'll stop briefly at this point and see if there are any questions.
I read in a book, I forgot because it's a long time ago, that McGeorge Bundy was the one that was on the phone and said that he basically said no airstrikes. Is this true?
No, Bundy said that the president did not see any reason for day one airstrikes. The profile of the U.S. was already too high, and the president did not understand why there needed to be more airstrikes. So that if Bissell and Cabell wanted to get on the telephone and tell the president why those airstrikes were still needed, they could. They declined to get on the phone with the president. Bundy simply told them that the president didn't understand why there needed to be more airstrikes, and so he didn't want any unless they would tell him why, and they wouldn't tell him why.
Thank you.
If I seem kind of adamant about this, you can tell I'm still annoyed. Anybody else? Okay. Well, here's the real point of this to the JFK attack in Dallas, to the conspiracy, is that they're beginning the day of the landing, and certainly the day after the landings totally failed. The military leaders of the mission, Hawkins and Easterline, had been misled by Bissell on the airstrikes. He had blamed JFK when we now know that the earlier strikes had been cut in number and size at Bissell's initiative, not JFK's. We know that they had not been informed of their protest about the landings. And from that point on, Bissell and basically Barnes and the people above him in the CIA, who really didn't know that Helms had managed to displace himself, wasn't even part of it, and Dulles had kind of done the same thing, which left Bissell the only one to actually tell the official story. During the Taylor Commission hearings on the failure, which JFK had ordered, the CIA and Bissell totally misled the Taylor Commission and covered up the fact that while the Joint Chiefs had endorsed the landing, it was only contingent with the fact that there would be a major anti-Castro uprising, and all the intelligence possessed by the CIA gave no indication of that. Even the CIA's own IG gutted them on the point that they had absolutely no intelligence saying that there was an uprising. They just stopped talking about it, basically, in all the planning meetings. They had failed to advise anyone that all of the major anti-Castro groups on the island had literally been destroyed and rounded up 3 weeks before the landings. They did not warn anyone, or they ignored the Joint Chiefs Staff report on issues with the air threats and logistics. Something else I discuss in the book that I won't go into here is we've managed to turn up the fact that there was likely going to be a major false flag operation going on, arranged by Bissell and the Navy and Navy intelligence to stage an attack on Guantanamo, which would have triggered a major carrier airstrike. And a carrier group was moved into position to do that without JFK's knowledge. None of that was shared with the Taylor Commission. I cover that and the evidence for it in the book In Denial. The upshot of all of this embarrassment, which would have, not only Bissell's career was in danger as it was, obviously, but his whole reputation would have been blown apart if the truth of what he had done had come forth at that point in time. What he did instead was to take all the misinformation he could muster and go to Easterline and tell Easterline that everything was JFK's fault. Easterline, who was just traumatized, immediately picked up that story and went to Miami. And Easterline himself says in his in interviews in oral history, he went to Miami and personally apologized to all of the CIA wave station staff and as many of the Cubans he could find, apologized the fact that the U.S. had failed them because of JFK's decisions. So basically, the whole storyline of JFK's failure and the fact that JFK betrayed the brigade came from Bissell through Easterline, and that essentially created this legacy from that point on that everyone involved with the brigade had been betrayed by JFK, and it festered and festered and festered into just a pure sense of hatred for those that have been involved. And of course, those that have been involved are the names that you will see in Tipping Point. So let's get past that. Okay. So that's where I was after having done In Denial, after having kind of amassed that level of new information about the story that had been told falsely to the Cubans that were involved in the Bay of Pigs landings. I said, I've got to pull myself back into 1963. You know, I've been submerged in 1959, 1960, 61, 62. Let's come back to 1963 and look at the other element that was added to this in 1963. And that led me back to revisiting what we had learned about Lee Oswald in 1963. And in particular, the dramatic shift that had happened between Lee Oswald in late 1962 and early 1963. And I'll have to ask, is everybody, and I presume most of you have either read or are very much aware of the manuscript that Lee Oswald wrote about his time in Russia? People generally know that. If you don't, it was a very anti-Russia, anti-Communist Party USA manuscript. He was very disenchanted with the Russians. He was very disenchanted with the Communist Party. It's the sort of thing that would have been great as a propaganda tool. You know, gullible American Marine goes to Russia and sees evil communism at work. Would have been a great propaganda piece. Strangely enough, it never got used for that purpose because in 1963, Oswald goes on an entirely new track. And Oswald goes on an entirely new track, which appears to be much more related to the FBI and anti-subversive activities, which were the FBI's charter in 1963, than anything else. And that leads him to reporting on the FPCC, reporting on his contacts with Cuban exiles. Lee Oswald becomes an element that will end up being used to point towards Cuba in the assassination. But that doesn't really emerge. That takes months to happen. And what we find by some of the connections that we know now, and one of the key connections that came out of the work in Tipping Point is, and this was stunning to me, and this is totally owed to a couple of other people, including David Boylan. The first person that Oswald contacted on his quest in New Orleans was not Bringuier and the DRE as we normally think of. It was a fellow named Ernesto Rodriguez, who ran a language school in New Orleans. Oswald was very interested in now all things Cuban and interested in learning Spanish, but he really wanted to know who were the Cubans in New Orleans who were, anti-Castro, who were the activists. And this fellow introduced him to his buddy, Carlos Bringuier, who he was very personally friendly with. The interesting thing about this is that this fellow who ran the language school was the brother of one of the main CIA political officers in JM Wave, who was doing political action for the Special Affairs Staff. And so what I try to point out is that suddenly, as of August 1963, whether he knows it or not. Lee Oswald has become well known to several segments of the CIA in Miami, at Miami Station, through their DRE contacts, through the case officers for DRE, through Rodriguez. It's impossible for people in Miami who are working on Cuban action not to know about Lee Oswald. The other thing, it's clear that there was an effort in play to use this image that was being created, that he was creating for himself, perhaps creating for himself driven by the FBI more than the CIA, but using that image for psychological or propaganda purposes. Again, I don't know how this escaped all of us. It certainly escaped me, but I was kind of awestruck to realize that DRE was not just reporting on Lee Oswald to CIA and to their case officers. They were taking the Oswald story to everybody. Oswald is a gullible American duped by the commies. They were taking him to all the Cuban exile groups. They were sharing information about him, and they were writing Congress. They were writing Congress, wanting Congress to investigate Lee Oswald and communist recruiting. So this whole thought of Lee Oswald being a lone nut that nobody knows about is just sad. I mean, it would be, if you're in Cuban activities, it's hard to avoid knowing about Lee Oswald. So the conclusion was Oswald was known to key CIA project staff. His identity was being used in a variety of CIA project activities, not just propaganda, but the interesting thing is who this political action SAS officer in Miami, one of his main charters was conducting a political warfare recruitment and counterintelligence campaign against Cuban diplomats in Mexico City and at the United Nations. In particular, people associated with Sylvia Duran. And the fact that this would all tie together in Miami, you know, we pursued these leads individually for decades, not realizing that they could all be tied together with one person who was doing this as part of his day job. I mean, this is his sanctioned activity, that he has this campaign going on both at the UN and in Mexico City. And the guy that he's working against at the UN turns out to be the key point in this new dialogue between Castro and the Kennedy administration, Carlos Lechuga. I probably mispronounced that, but it's just amazing that that could come together in one point. All right, let's stop there. Talk about a witch's brew. It's hard to find more of a witch's brew than that, but I'll go into some other areas. Do we have any more questions at this point? Some of that might be new to people if you haven't already read Tipping Point. Nope, not new. Gosh, I did a better job than I thought.
So Larry, was most of this Cuban activity with Oswald going on in New Orleans?
With Oswald himself, that summer, okay, July, August, and into September, my view is that Oswald was, I don't know if you'd even call it a mission, but he was serving as a source for the FBI, reporting on the anti-Castro Cuban elements that he was inserting himself with and in contact. And he was doing that, of course, by playing both sides of the street. We know for sure that Bringuier thought that he was a FPCC plant, that he was pro-communist before the street demonstration occurred. So he was really playing both sides of the street. So I guess, Gary, to answer your question, from Oswald's standpoint, what he was doing before he left New Orleans, yeah, that was Oswald's story. But the bigger story about Oswald was how the CIA was preparing to use information about Oswald for propaganda purposes and to insert that into the operations that they were conducting against Lechuga and Duran. And I think it's important to know that it wasn't just this SAS political action officer. He was also taking advantage of the games that he was playing of using the Amots who were working for Tony Sforza, because before Oswald even shows up in Mexico City, one of those Amots had already been sent to Mexico City to go to the embassy to feel out Duran and to collect information on Duran. So they had this operation going against the embassy in Mexico City and Duran and her boss before Oswald even got close to going to Mexico City.
Okay.
I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, that gives me some perspective. Thanks.
So let me just follow up on that. So you believe that Oswald was in Mexico City?
No, not necessarily. No. In fact, I tend to believe that he was not in Mexico City.
No, so do I.
Let me put it this way. He certainly wasn't in Mexico City according to the official record that the FBI presents to Warren Commission. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Nor was he in Mexico City the way the CIA presents it.
Yeah.
Now, did Oswald cross the border and go into Mexico? I have no idea. But no, I do not. I think what was going on at the embassies was totally irrespective of the real Lee Oswald. I tend to believe at this point in time that Lee Oswald himself was in Houston and in Dallas. And like I said, he might have been taken across the border for certain purposes, but not those games in Mexico City.
Yeah.
Actually, he would have been dangerous. One of the things about it is, if you put yourself into it, the CIA issues, it's much easier to use the image that had been created. You know, they've got the FPCC documents. They've got all this, the history they need. They can forge documents. Having Lee Oswald as part of an operation in Mexico City is the last thing you want. You want to send somebody who knows what they're doing. Oswald just could step all over himself, and who knows what he's going to say. I want to send somebody around there who's under my control, not independent. Bart, does that answer it? So no, I don't. I think that's a totally bogus story that we may never understand, but I see it as a follow-up to that initial Amot call and to the political action games that Rodriguez was playing against the embassy. If anybody, it may have been another Amot that was sent in with his credentials. They had some really well-trained guys playing that game. Anybody else?
Hi, Larry, can you hear me?
Oh, just vaguely. I can.
Yeah, this is Ian Hughes. You can see me on there as user. I'd just like to go back to what you were saying about McGeorge Bundy, because I saw an interview with Fletcher Prouty in which he said he had a report. I'm going to post the bit from my book here that I used. It was based on an interview I saw with Fletcher Prouty. And he said that Bundy actually, Bundy telephoned General Cabell to say dawn airstrikes the following morning should not be launched unless it was from a strip within the captured beachhead. And
that is correct. Absolutely. Yeah. Bundy relayed that order from Kennedy. Kennedy had said the day before, basically, you know, we've done all these airstrikes. Unless you can convince me that we need more, the plan is that you'll do them from the beachhead. And basically, we all know Kennedy. It's kind of like, convince me we have to have something else. So absolutely, I would agree with that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting because Prouty was showing the report. He had the report in his hands, and he said it disproved Kennedy's guilt in that area. But you think that you think therefore that George Bundy was just relaying an order from Kennedy. That's your,
Oh, absolutely. And
yeah, right.
and
So
I
you
think
disagree
that,
with Prouty then? Yeah.
yeah, he just relayed the order. And the problem was, and I tried to, they were not having regular meetings. Kennedy was new. He wanted to distance himself. He trusted these guys. He trusted Dulles. And so he wasn't having the kind of ongoing hour by hour operational meetings that a president these days would have, or that Johnson had on Vietnam. He was kind of like, you guys, I trust you to handle this unless you tell me something needs to change. And in that incident, nobody had told him, had updated him on the failure of the Cuban airstrikes and that half of their force was still there. Nobody had relayed that information. So basically he did issue that order, and he says it doesn't seem to me, we've gotten too much visibility already, because that whole thing of staging the air attacks in advance as being done by defecting Cuban pilots had been exposed with like 15 minutes.
Right.
And he was not impressed with that. It's kind of like, our hand is going to show more clearly if we do more. I don't want to do more unless you guys tell me we have to. And that's, Bundy relayed those orders, absolutely, which is why Bundy offered Cabell and Bissell the chance to get back on the phone. It's like, don't complain to me. You're going to have to convince the president. Or you, more like, you're going to have to tell him why, okay?
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah. Therefore, this is jumping ahead a bit, but what do you think about George Bundy writing the the order to continue the involvement in Vietnam on the day before Kennedy was assassinated, as far as I know? I forgot what it's called now. It was 263 or something like that. It was.
This will be a personal answer to your question.
Sure.
I have come not to like George Bundy very much.
Yeah, me neither.
Because I see Big Bundy as being a political figure. Bundy would shift, when JFK was there and driving him, Bundy might have been a good response, like a counterpoint. But if it wasn't JFK in charge, Bundy would pretty much tend to cave in or do whatever the way the wind was blowing.
Right.
And so I guess to answer your question, I don't think anything that Bundy did or did not do was particularly, well, maybe I give even a better answer to that. When Manchester interviewed Bundy and asked him what he was doing after word of the assassination came from Dallas, and would he kind of like go through his actions? Because what you'd expect is that Bundy might have tried to take control to some extent as national security advisor. Bundy said, well, I really didn't, I talked to a couple of people, but I was really started going through the files to get ready for the transition. Like, wait a minute. You're thinking more about Johnson than you are Kennedy, aren't you? So I almost view Bundy as a non-entity in a way. That's not answering your question.
No,
Bundy,
it's very interesting. That's very useful.
Bundy absolutely knew that John Kennedy was not going to continue committing conventional forces to Vietnam if there was any other option. That was not the plan, because what he knew was that Kennedy had ordered a totally different approach by emphasizing covert operations against the North and turning that over to the military rather than the CIA. He knew that's what Kennedy wanted to do. Kennedy wanted to get the conventional forces out. Now, what he didn't know was what Johnson was going to want to do.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's-
great.
it's-
Yeah, we could have
so-
a whole meeting about that, couldn't we?
Yeah,
That's
that's
very
why
interesting.
once I kind of classified him as a political Washington advisor, I kind of took him off the plate.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great information. It's really good to get your point of view. Thank you. You're
All
obviously
right,
the
so a
expert.
witch's brew, and that really actually kind of leads us to what was going on in 1963. Not just interestingly, we the JFK research community, for various reasons, has come to think that it was all about Vietnam. Truly, it was not all about Vietnam. Kennedy was very much still worried about Berlin. If you start looking at the State Department communications with Kennedy, what Kennedy was trying to juggle a lot of problems in preparation for the 64 elections. And in some senses, that meant resolving them. In some senses, it meant deferring them. Kennedy was an ultimate pragmatist. He knew what had gone on in Southeast Asia was kind of working. Laos was still fairly stable. He had managed to get out of the neutrality crisis there, and things were stabilizing and actually improving in Laos. Things weren't going terribly downhill in South Vietnam. He'd ordered a new program, like I said, against the North. He was facing Soviet pressure in Berlin still. Cuba, quite frankly, might have been his biggest election problem, which is why I think we see his response to when Castro had first made a tentative approach to Kennedy in the spring of 1963. Kennedy was interested, but there was a lot of pushback, and even Robert Kennedy told him that it could be politically disastrous. So he did something totally different. He set up a new committee. He put it under the State Department, gave the CIA a minor role, and actually tasked the Joint Chiefs with setting up a whole new, highly efficient, organized, aggressive covert action program against Cuba. That he was going to apply the same pressure program to Cuba that he was going to apply to North Vietnam. When Castro reapproached or made another very serious offer, it's pretty clear. And this is getting back to Bundy. Both Bundy and Helms tried to downplay this, that Kennedy was really interested in Castro's offer. But because we have the tapes, because we have the internal memos, that was misinformation on their part. Kennedy was seriously, he was even telling William Atwood that people were going to have to resign their jobs at State Department, at the UN, because of the negotiations that were going to immediately go underway with Castro. And I personally feel that Kennedy was going to push really hard to be announcing early on in 1964 that Cuba had become neutral, the Russians were leaving, and were lifting the embargo. And actually he told Castro that in a speech, and Castro had essentially responded through his liaison that he was willing to talk about all of Kennedy. He was willing to talk about all of Kennedy's points. Castro was under a lot of economic pressure, and what most people fail to realize is that he had just conducted a purge of all the Soviet-oriented communists in his own government because he felt so betrayed by the Soviets during the missile crisis. He was more upset with the Russians than he was with Jack Kennedy at that point in time. As far as the Cuba program itself, what we see in this witch's brew within the CIA. So that was the broad picture. Okay, within the CIA, things are actually much worse. Mongoose had been abandoned. Kennedy had created a new Cuban coordinating committee. There was no more special group augmented. RFK was working with this Cuban coordinating committee. Task Force W had been replaced by the Special Affairs Staff section under Fitzgerald, who was aggressively pursuing regime change in Cuba, coups. There were 4 or 5 major programs going on against Cuba. And I don't think that Kennedy himself understood how disconnected they were. I don't know if he wasn't getting the message. People were running their own game. But here's an example. RFK had convinced Fitzgerald and a lot of other people on this coordinating group that the new autonomous program under our teammate was going to be they were going to combine AmWorld, which was an autonomous operations program, moving military action against Cuba offshore. They were going to combine that with a new program to create a coup through the AmTrunk program. And then they were going to convince Curbelo to try to organize an assassination program on Castro within Cuba under the AmLash, AmWhipper. You had like all these different cryptonyms, all these different programs going on. At the same time, the U.S. is starting to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on Artemis project so he can operate offshore and nobody can relate it to the U.S. Fitzgerald is letting JM Wave create a totally new strike group called Commando Mambises that's going to operate out of Florida and stage attacks on Cuba with these new motherships. And it's like, wait a minute. You said the president was worried about deniability and he let RFK move all this stuff on shore. And you're letting the people in Miami launch all these missions against Cuba from bases in Florida, and which are exposed within 2 months. And the press is actually chasing the boats back to where they're being moored in Florida. I mean, this is chaos. And all the people at Miami Station are just totally frustrated. They're still doing missions. They're not sure why. They don't really see anything working. It is just a witch's brew as far as the people in Miami are concerned. We even have a statement from one of the CI officers. It shows up in Don Boney's book, who's interviewed, said, you know, we were running really serious operations using our Cuban volunteers into Cuba, and we didn't realize that this was just for show. That if we had known that the Kennedy brothers were doing what they were doing, you know, we might have gone after them ourselves. Well, maybe he didn't, or he probably wouldn't have said that. But as I cover in Tipping Point, there were people that animated that I think did decide to use their assets and go after him. And that led to Dallas. But witch's brew, 63, not good.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Just digressing a bit, I just got a question as well. What my research turned up that Curtis LeMay, the whole Dr. Strangelove thing, he wanted to launch a first strike against the USSR, and he resented the fact Kennedy wouldn't go along with it, and that some people have put that down as a motive for maybe some degree of his involvement, the Pentagon's involvement.
I can answer that. I guess the question is, are you all willing to give me another 5? I can explore that, but I can't give a. That really all goes back to, and if you read my book called Surprise Attack, I think it would lend some interpretation of that.
Right.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff had determined immediately circa 1948-49 that there was no defense against atomic attack. And this is written in papers that whoever launches first will win. There's no defeating it. There's no whatever. And they were actually assigned by Truman to convene a group that would meet periodically once a year to do a strategic risk analysis to determine at what point in time the Soviet Union might possess the resources to do a first strike. And they did. They reported that on it every year. And but the interesting thing is they also reported the other direction, like when could we get away with doing a first strike? And the presidents from Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy on essentially pursued a no first strike document. But, and this isn't my personal opinion, this is the Joint Chiefs, their point of view, and this, LeMay simply expressed it for all of them, was you guys gave us a job. You know, our job is to make sure America doesn't lose. We told you the only way we can do that is at some point in time, if they think they can get away with it, they will. You agreed, everybody agreed. We will tell you that, and it's your decision. Our decision will be if it looks like we have the advantage but they might feel that they do, we should strike first. So not just LeMay, but the Joint Chiefs through 3 different administrations took that position, that our position is the way we win this is not wait for them to launch first. So does LeMay kind of defines that because of who LeMay is, but that was literally, he's expressing their position. If you want me to win, and I have to add this, all of those people on the Joint Chiefs staff at that point in time had come out of World War II, and they came out of Pearl Harbor. And in their oral history interviews, they will all tell you, we almost lost World War II. Yeah. And they will all tell you they were not about to let that happen again. And again, I'm not defending the mentality, but I also wasn't there.
Sure, yeah.
And it's like, you know, our job will be to win a war. And if that means we have to start it, we just told you we can't let them start it. We're not going to win. So anyway.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That's great. Yeah. I'll certainly have to look at your books as soon as I've finished me and Lee and the others.
It's one of those long books. It took me a lot of time. Yeah, it took me a lot of time on that one. I learned more than I ever wanted to know.
Yeah, thanks for your expertise on that. That's great.
You bet. Okay, tipping point. So Bart, you asked me, you know, what did it mean and why did I select that title? And that is because I see the tipping point that emerged as of the fall of 1963 as involving these elements, that JFK had not gained any friends within the CIA. He had not gained any friends over what he was doing in Laos and Vietnam because he had taken all of operational responsibility away from them. And when I talk about the CIA, I mean plans and operations. I mean the people under Helms in 1963, under Fitzgerald and Sass, under Shackley at JM. I'm talking about the operations guys. They weren't pleased, and they thought that Kennedy was about to do the same thing in Cuba that he had done in Laos. And I believe they were right. That would be my assessment. And it might have worked even. They had not been pleased. If you couldn't find anybody more unpleased than the people at JM Wave who had worked with William Harvey and Mongoose during the missile crisis. They felt that JFK had not taken his opportunity then. So as soon as they heard about the fact that he was in communications with Castro, and that started being discussed in the summer, we have documents and I traced the chronology of that, started being discussed, there was adamant opposition, but it wasn't real, and it came and it went. And they thought that it was off the table, and then suddenly JFK in late September and early October started a back channel dialogue with Cuba without telling the CIA. He didn't tell anybody. He was doing it strictly through the State Department. And he made it very implicit. As a matter of fact, the State Department said, if you involve the CIA, this will never work. Because these Cuba Project people, these people in operations are so devoted to this mission against Castro that they'll sabotage it. The interesting thing is that's exactly what happened as soon as the CIA director was told about the back channel operations. Helms started to sabotage the back channel operations, and the interesting way is how he did it. And he didn't do it. He started pushing back directly against JFK, but that wasn't enough. He started in Washington a pushback process, all sorts of memos opposing it. We should war game this. Don't go too fast. Don't trust Castro. But what he did, which there's no excuse that he ever should have done because it was overt interference, is he advised both JM Wave in Miami and JM Wave's subsidiary station in Mexico City that these contacts were underway, and the key Cuban contact, who had never been on anybody's radar before, was suddenly being assigned to AMOTS to bring under surveillance and determine any people that they could identify that could be used in counterintelligence operations against him or to leverage him. So Helms is doing a twofold thing. He's politically pushing back, and he's starting to use his organization to do it. But in doing so, he informs people in Miami and Mexico City what's starting to go on with the Cubans. Worse than that, and I cover this in Denial, there's good evidence to show that the CIA folks were already learning about this through intercepts, wiretaps. We know they had Lisa Howard's apartment wiretapped. They were beginning to collect information directly on what the president was doing. Now, the interesting thing is that's all political. That's standard. It's kind of like, what is he doing? Because we're going to oppose it. That's not, that's not something you're supposed to do to a president. It's not unknown for the CIA to do that. We know that Angleton had launched collections efforts against former presidents. He was not at all unwilling to do it against people in administrations. So this is what was going on, and this was how nasty it is. And what I have here are a key quote. The guys that were directly involved in the talks that were to begin in November, here's a quote from one of them once they realized what had happened and how this had trickled down, not only to the CIA operations staff, but to the exiles, the anti-Castro military people that they were working with. And this is from Atwood. And he became convinced, as I bring it in Tipping Point, those people that were involved in the negotiations became convinced this is literally what happened, that Kennedy was assassinated because this information had trickled down to the wrong people.
Yeah, JFK basically pissed everyone off.
Everybody within the CIA and within CIA Cuban. The funny thing is, and I got to admit, I was alive in 1963, so I admit it. JFK had support from many of his policies. He had support within the State Department. He had support, but this within CIA operations, which was at that point in time, had been kicked out of Vietnam largely and Laos. It was totally focused on Cuba. So Bart, I agree. Everybody was totally, and they weren't bashful about sharing their opinions with the guys that they were working with, the Cubans they were working with.
And add on Vietnam, of course, that must have been some tipping point as well, because he was doing it on Cuba, and now all of a sudden you get Vietnam where he says, I'm going to pull out the advisors. So the intelligence agencies are basically having their hands more and more tied, basically, instead of the free reign these people have enjoyed since the Second World War, the OAS and the OSS, when the same people were in charge then, was mostly in charge there.
Before that, literally what you had was George Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles running the country's policy.
Yeah.
You know, state didn't just agree with CIA. The two brothers agreed what they were going to do, and then they told Eisenhower. And as long as it was, you know, forward leaning, Ike was for that stuff. So they're gone. They're off the table. And now, it's clear that they don't have the leverage. Helms doesn't have the leverage. I mean, I would say, and what I posit is the people in Langley know this. Helms knows this. He shares this with Angleton. Angleton shares it with Harvey. They know that JFK is going to go his own way. Yeah. And I'm absolutely sure that when Harvey went down to Miami, he shared that with the guys that he had been working with, who were probably the deputy chief station Moore and David Morales. You'll see in Tipping Point a guy named Moore emerge, who was a much more seminal character than we've ever realized before, I think, because he was in charge of everything. He did everybody's personnel reviews. He knew what everybody was working on, and he had actually run the maritime missions with all the Cubans against. So yeah, they were all pissed off. They weren't bashful about sharing it, and I think when they started sharing it with people like Robertson and Lynch and those people that had been at the Bay of Pigs and bought this whole Bissell story, that's where it went over. It went off the cliff.
I totally agree with what you're saying, but there's one player that hasn't been discussed, and this is where the work of John Newman and the documents that I've got from Malcolm Blunt, and that points to the Pentagon, and especially special group. And in a nutshell, special group are basically a group of people in Washington that are part of the National Security Council, but there's always one, the head of the CIA or the deputy director of the CIA, they're involved. And if you read the documents, you can basically see that foreign policy is dictated towards Cuba in those documents. There's a document that I've got, I have to look it up, but one of them basically pretty much state like, we're going to need that many rifles, that much explosive, that many grenades, this, that, and the other. And I'm going, the CIA is the instrument. I mean, all the fingers point to the CIA, but they're actually the instrument of the Pentagon. Because if you think anyone that says like, well, the CIA did this, I'll tell you one thing, Langley would have been turned into a field, and they would have poured salt into the ground so that nothing ever grows there again. They would have not gone against the orders of the Pentagon or so. The CIA was owned by the Pentagon as such, and this special group. I mean, they do a lot themselves, but there is an oversight, and that is called the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and so forth. They are just...
And Saxa, and this is, Bart, you've given me an opportunity to get myself in trouble, so I'll do that.
Good.
This is where I disagree with Newman, and Newman is going to have to convince me, because I've seen the same documents you're describing.
Yeah.
And this goes back to the fact that beginning 2 years before, JFK initiated a program called Switchback, which was really to take, and this was actually, Alan Dulles, believe it or not, had agreed to this after the Bay of Pigs. Alan Dulles actually went on record to the Taylor Commission saying that the CIA did not deserve to be involved in major military operations, paramilitary operations, covert operations. That's actually in the Taylor Commission report. Okay. JFK took that and started to run with it with this new program called Switchback. The first play, and he went to the Joint Chiefs and literally said, okay, guys, the CIA does not know how to do this. And by the way, McNamara encouraged him. I've got the documents that show McNamara told Kennedy, the reason all these CIA operations are failing is they don't have the resources. They really don't have the trained people. They're using all of these surrogates that they try to train and it doesn't work. We need to hand it off to the military. So McNamara helps convince Kennedy to issue this directive to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to SACSA, which is their military planning special operations group. SACSA is where Prouty worked, by the way. This is why Prouty knows some things about it. So the first directive is put a program in place to put them in charge of paramilitary operations in Vietnam. Okay. But then and I can't, this is from memory, so don't hold me to it. By early 1963, there's a directive that goes to SACSA that says, prepare a covert war plan. You guys are getting this. You take it. We haven't told the CIA yet, but I want staff studies of exactly how the military is going to take over operations against Cuba. And as a matter of fact, I've seen, this is strange, and I write about it in Surprise Attack to some extent, which is why many people haven't seen it. There's pushback because Kennedy agrees with the Joint Chiefs that the person who's going to be in charge of this new military action is Commander-in-Chief Atlantic, Sinkland, okay? Sinkland is the same guy that JFK in 1962 ordered to prepare a full-scale invasion plan of Cuba and to exercise it. And that was actually exercised with deployed Marine groups, amphibious groups. The only thing that they didn't do was they actually planned to do a full-scale landing and take over a small island, which was the reverse spell to Cuba. They didn't do that because a hurricane interfered with it. That didn't happen in 62. The missile crisis did happen. He went back and said, Joint Chiefs, you guys can do this. I want a new plan. I want it weaponized. And it included everything that they were going to need to do to replace and accelerate what the CIA had been doing against Cuba, and called out, like what you might, this is a staff study. So they start calling out about how many units, what kind of weapons, everything else. LeMay objected to the first study because of LeMay's objection was that Kennedy was giving it to the Navy. And LeMay didn't think that was right. You know, what happened to the Air Force? We know how to do things. The Joint Chiefs were fighting each other. So I guess what I would say, and without getting mired down into that, I certainly don't want to ignore that there was a Pentagon element involved with Cuban actions and Cuban military operations, and they were getting ready. And I believe go back and you can see the conflict. If you read Brad Ayer's book, you can see that the Pentagon is actually starting to attach trainers to the CIA's operations in Miami in 63, and they want nothing to do with it. The CIA doesn't want them. They don't want them. They want them to go away. They won't even, when the guys prepare reports on what the CIA is doing and the CIA is training, CIA won't even let them share with their Army unit that they're assigned from. There's a war that is about to go on, or is going on, between the CIA and the military. If JFK had lived, I have no doubt that the CIA would have lost that war, and the military would have. It was going to go one of two ways. Either he was going to do a deal with Castro, or the Pentagon would wage a new level of warfare against Cuba. And when I'm talking about pressure, I think he probably would have ramped it up to blockade. That's just my opinion. Because he had to have that resolved before the election. I don't know. For those of you who are not as old as I am, I got to tell you, JFK wasn't guaranteed to win the 64 election. It was much more, there was much more opposition than you might think. He needed some leverage. He needed leverage. He needed to win. He needed to win to show that he was strong. And he would have gotten it one way or the other. He would have either gotten the Soviets kicked out, or he would have turned loose the Pentagon. So, that's just so obviously at some point, John and I John's going to have to show me more. What John hasn't shown me yet is how operationally whatever the Pentagon was doing leads to the attack in Dallas. Yeah. When he can show me in Tipping Point, I believed I show how it actually leads by individual travel, everything else to Dallas. If he can show me how that traces back to the military, I'm certainly willing to look.
Well, you hit the nail on the head, because next week, I think Project JFK on the 23rd, on the Wednesday, John Newman is doing a 2.5, 3-hour presentation. I think there's 300 slides in that presentation. So, yeah, it's going to be complete overkill and overdose on the whole thing. But I think you should join this, and because I'm going to be there, but several others, I think, from this group. I posted
If you
something
could
in
send me a
Facebook.
link, that would be great. And by the way, I will give there's no way I'm ever going to attempt to outgun John on number of slides. I've just, if you've ever seen a Newman presentation, I'm just not, I mean,
Alan Dale told me yesterday, he says, well, so far we've got 282. I said, so what does that mean? He says, well, it's going to be over 300. And I was like, my God, that's going to be a complete overkill. As far as I know, there's 100 free tickets. So, but I'll send you the link, and I've posted the link on Facebook as well. So it's just a matter of registering really quick, and that's it basically.
I know it sounds like this came up early. It sounds like a preemptive strike we were talking about with the Air Force before. Overkill.
But it's that starts at midnight UK time. Just to let you know.
Yeah, it's late. Yeah, I know it's late.
Very late. That's 1 a.m. Italy time.
Yeah.
Well, that might be in my favor at least. But all right. Well, let me go on and but it's good that we got to do that. And I've made no bash. I've said exactly the same thing to Alan. I haven't actually said it to John. We don't talk that much directly, but in any event. Okay, let's go. Here's what the book is about. So let me kind of conclude with that. And I think that Bart, I think it will make what I just said to you more real. What I have tried to do is taking this assumption about a tipping point, about the Castro negotiations as being what drove certain individuals over the edge. I have attempted to reverse engineer the attack in Dallas. And that is really what is in Tipping Point. By using the sources and interrelating them and networking them, I call out specific names and roles. Who went as part of the paramilitary team, who went as part of the team to frame Oswald, who was used in Dallas, including Jack Ruby and some Dallas police officer as logistics in setting up and running the operation. I've tried to call out how the attack itself was staged in terms of being a typical infantry style ambush. That, by the way, these guys that I named had already practiced, because it was the same attack that had been planned twice to execute against Castro, including in his motorcade going to Veradero Beach. So I get very specific. Now, that doesn't mean I'm right, but I get very specific, which is what I'm going to expect from John in return. Because this is the only way I can evaluate it. If I can't associate it to a name, a person, did somebody travel to Dallas? Can you connect them to Dallas? Then I just can't mentally process it. It's just speculation. Then I write about the fact that I think it was designed to be a visible conspiracy. I don't think that there was any effort in the attack at all to conceal the fact that there were multiple shooters. It was intended to be seen as a conspiracy, and it was intended to be seen as a conspiracy related to Lee Oswald, but more specifically to Castro. And I bring up the point that John Martino mentioned, and that was that the attack in Dallas actually had two elements. One was the shooting attack on the president. The second was the effort to frame Castro. And that second part of the attack did not occur as it was planned, because Oswald was never intended to be taken into custody. Once he was in custody, whatever was planned as part of that frame, good, bad, or indifferent, didn't happen, which is why what we see linking to Castro after the fact is so weak. And it does not, a point that I would make is, if professionals like Dave Phillips, William Harvey, who knew how to plan an assassination to implicate someone, look at Harvey's notes. He talked with Angleton. Angleton and Harvey know exactly what kind of evidence you leave in place to frame somebody and connect them to a communist sponsor. They discuss it. Harvey has it in his notes. If that had been this plan and put into play, we wouldn't see what we ended up seeing, which was even when John Roselli goes to Washington, D.C. to say, oh, Castro did it, I knew the people that involved, he has no names. When John Martino goes to the press and the FBI trying to say Castro is involved, he has no names. I guarantee you, if the right people, the real pros that planned this kind of operation had been involved, they knew the names of Castro counterintelligence agents. They had plenty of names. They could have faked things. You would have found a letter, real letters to Oswald. You would have found real, it would have worked. They would have sold it. So either that wasn't done, the people who worked on the Castro frame part of it really weren't pros, and it was a half-ass job, basically, or there was something that we never saw. And I tend to think of it as the former, because as I discussed in Tipping Point, then you see a knee-jerk reaction. You see this kind of like, oh, Washington is responding by saying it was one person, right? One person, unconnected, has nothing to do with any conspiracy. And for the next 2 weeks, all of these people that I have as suspects are trying to feed in this Castro connection, and they have nothing. They have nothing since New Orleans. All they can fall back on are the interviews and all the headlines and everything from New Orleans, which is what you see on the cover of Tipping Point. That headline is, it's not recent. It's not what Oswald's been doing. Who was Oswald in touch with? It's dates back to New Orleans. So that's kind of my wrap up of what's in the book, good, bad, or indifferent. But I do address all those points in the book. And I guess that takes us to the fact that, as hopefully you all know, the book is serialized on the Mary Farrell Foundation, or the work is. We did expand it a little bit. We put it into a book form, which is available on Amazon. I don't know if the ebook will, Rex is having so much trouble with Amazon publishing. I don't know if he'll live long enough to make it available as an ebook. His publishing program, he had it ready and submitted and basically could get no support. And they wrote back and said, hey, you've got to go to a totally new program if you want to do that. And anyway, all the revenues of the book will go to the Mary Farrell Foundation to fund new document collections and digitization. So that's why I didn't go to a regular publisher. There are advantages to that. Two things as follow-up. I've got a couple of people volunteered. We're working on an expanded index that might be of more help to researchers. I have no idea when. If we can get it, we'll put that up on the Mary Farrell. And as I said earlier, David Boylan and I are working on an examination of the Matthews work with Ray January, which I think, well, we will offer it. We will offer our thoughts as to who the Cuban and the American were at Redbird Airport, as well as to who the young man and woman were who were there with Lee Oswald. Can't prove it, but we can float some persons of interest. And interestingly enough, all of them connect back to the same people that you see named in Tipping Point. And it just as to the guy who was with Oswald at McCowan's, and to the two guys that we think were with Oswald at Sylvia Odio's.
You have the opinion that Oswald was there?
Yes. See, I can give a short answer. I know that's I know that's unexpected at this point in time, but yes.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's just too many bits where you just go,
I can't prove it. That's what you said, opinion. So at this point, what sways me is two things. I do believe Oswald was at McCowan's. Okay. And so that means he was traveling with an anti-Castro Cuban at McCowan's. There's good evidence to show that he was in Houston and had been taken to Houston because they wanted to expose him to McCowan. So I have no problem seeing them taking him to Dallas. And actually, the appearance at Dallas, as I speculate in Tipping Point, may even have been part of a sanctioned counterintelligence operation. I believe that the guys that were being used at this point in time in and around Oswald were playing a dual role. They were doing some things that were sanctioned, and they had already gone rogue. Any other
Larry,
questions? Yes, sir.
yeah, Larry, this is Neil Safferty. I seem to be appearing as Elaine Safferty. I'm not gender fluid. That's my wife's password. I'm really looking forward to reading your book, actually. I think it was a fantastic presentation. Thank you. I've got a few questions, if you don't mind. So if you look at the characters like Santiago, Hall, Howard, Hargreaves, Seymour, Diaz Garcia, Del Valle, do you have any documentary evidence that they were in Dallas on the 22nd?
Vidal, absolutely, yes. The FBI reported on about Vidal making multiple trips to Dallas in October and November. So yes, he was definitely in Dallas. As far as Hargraves being there, all I have is Acker's FBI report that Hargraves said he had been there, and Twyman's interview with Hargraves, where Hargraves says, yes, I've been there, but I have nothing documentary.
Okay.
On some of the other characters that we mentioned, some of the Cubans, on a couple of them, we do have documentary evidence. Others not.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Do you have any thoughts on the Roscoe White story?
Oh, goodness.
We've got you entrapped now, Larry.
I have some definite thoughts on the J.D. Tippett story, which I cover in Tipping Point. Roscoe White, it's a mystery to me. I'm not, there are some things that I have to be honest, I am not persuaded White wasn't involved. What I say in Tipping Point is I call out some of the Dallas police that I think were dirty and were involved in some fashion. And I think there's a case that can be made by the guys I name. There are at least 2 or 3 other people like White that I don't have a case that I'm willing to stand behind. I'm certainly open to it.
Fair enough. I mean, I'm looking forward to the DPD section. That'll be great.
Yeah, I would love to hear about that. So here's my question. I've never asked you this, and you've read it about it. I don't know if anyone asked you. What's your take on Prayer Man?
Careful.
Not another big sigh. That's not a loaded question. It's just,
Well, no, Bart, the reason I'm trying to separate it is I always mentally have a hard time separating Prayer Man from the second floor encounter, as you and I have discussed. I mean, the second floor encounter, I have no doubt about being bogus. Okay. Where Oswald was, I have no problem at all of Oswald standing by the window/door at the head of the stairs looking out. I have no problem with that. So could it be? Yeah, I absolutely, at this point, I'll be honest, I don't trust Frazier or Frazier's memory on what was going on and what Frazier now says.
Yeah, that brings me. I was going to ask that about the so-called rifleman. I mean, it's like, and he kept it hidden for that long.
If you forgot to mention that to the Dallas police and the FBI in 1963, I don't bring it up to me now. Okay,
Yeah,
Will.
yeah.
I just like, okay. So I guess my honest answer is I certainly have no problem with it being here. I can't see the photographic evidence that convinces me one way or the other. I think Oswald was on the first floor.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think
that is the
Oswald was
first
in the
floor.
lunchroom.
I mean,
I think the
it
black
is.
guys were telling the truth. They saw him. So I just, and this was where it gets real personal opinion. Whatever Oswald thought was told or whatever, Oswald was in some sense a smart ass. So to see him saying, "Oh, I'm going to go over to the door and look out when the motorcade's passing by," I have no problem with that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Eddie Piper said that. Yeah, it's not just, the thing is, like, it's more than just badge, man. I mean, it's, the picture is one thing, getting a better quality picture and then looking at the evidence. Actually the better quality picture would be the icing on the case on top of the evidence that shows where Oswald stated that he was outside in the Fritz notes and in the Hosty document, which then also leads back to some other notes that he took that Larry Hapanen posted as such. The second floor lunchroom encounter not happening because it's bullshit because of Hosty and Bookout. So it is all interrelated. And I'm amazed
I
that,
tell you
yeah, go on.
what convinced me is the newspaper article that showed up the next day that had quotes the TSBD administrator saying, "Oh yeah, I saw Oswald down there by the storage closet on the first floor." And you never hear from this guy again. As far as I'm
August
concerned,
Campbell.
that did it. Yeah, okay.
August Campbell, he was the vice president of the building, which is quite surprising because also, what am I saying? He didn't even have to appear for the Warren Commission either. He was just not invited as such. And then of course you've got Ken Biffle, who noted everything down, what was happening inside the TSBD, and wrote down as well that Oswald was seen below and trying to get out and leaving as such. Plus the so-called Revel document, which is a 2-pager, which is a list of people that were inside of the Texas School Book Depository whose names and addresses were taken when they were leaving the building, and Oswald is on the top of that list, basically, which is quite a weird list because some people that weren't part of the TSBD are actually went back inside and whose names were noted down as well, like Peggy Joyce Hawkins is one of them. So yeah, I mean, it all interconnects one way or another with these things as such. I'm amazed that that paperwork was actually saved. And, you know, I mean, the Fritz notes, for instance, they were hidden for more than 30 years. And then they were presented to the ARB via anonymous donor. And I'm trying to find out. I think I'm going to email Jeremy Gunn in Morocco and try and find out if he is willing maybe to let loose who did this thing as such. But yeah, but
I think this is my whole picture of this. And there was a point in my life where I did a little film and movie production. I see it as a point of that what happened in the first 6 months is much like a film. You make a film by leaving things out as much as you make a film by putting in. So all that had to be done was to make sure that certain of these things didn't show up at the time when you were making the public impression. Well, it doesn't matter if they show up late. That's going to be revisionist history. As long as we can control this for 6 months, we won't talk to this person. I don't care if they do an oral history interview later. We won't talk to this person. Then we sold it. It's essentially a media sales job that you're doing. And of course the CIA, they're experts at this. Anyway, any other questions?
You've had two. Go ahead, Neil.
Sorry, it's just I had a couple of more if you don't mind, Tony.
Go ahead,
Larry.
Neil.
So the first question, you mentioned that you've done some extensive research on Ruby and you're also covering the Tippit murder in the book. What's your view on Larry Crayford and his rapid exit from Dallas. And the second question is just like a generic overview question. All the years that you've been looking at this, and with all the witnesses you may have interviewed as well, have you had a smoking gun or eureka moment with a witness, or has that kind of thing happened from a document release?
Okay, first one, Crawford got out of town just as a couple of Ruby's girls got out of town as soon as they could, because they absolutely knew that Ruby had been involved with some people and things related that they suspected. I won't say knew, that they very much suspected were involved with the assassination, possibly with Oswald directly. And Crayford, I mean, they just left. Those departures, there were at least 2 of his dancers that left town, including the policeman who married her, and they both left town. Ian Briggs did a wonderful job of
Harry Olsen.
Yeah. So and I write about Olsen extensively in Tipping Point. So I put those all in the same plane. There were people that absolutely knew enough to be convinced that Ruby had been involved in some fashion, and B, it was dangerous to know that. And I also know that Connie's good friend, who was a reporter, who was covering Jack Ruby and covered the crime scene in Dallas, who died within, I think it was 4 months, and had told her that he was looking into Ruby. His death should certainly be considered suspicious. He was murdered. So if I get, the interesting thing is people have speculated about the murders and everything. My view is that the people that really got killed that you connect to the assassination were people that knew too much about Jack Ruby. Those are the people that were at risk and who either fled or got murdered.
Interesting.
Your second question, smoking gun.
I mean, yeah. Did you have a eureka moment from a witness you interviewed, or has it really been through the documentation releases that's put it together for you?
It's through the witnesses, but I don't know that it's a single witness. The smoking gun. I'm going to go back up to that sources slide. The smoking gun, or the smoking gun experience, was when I saw that all of those, what was known by all of those people was interconnected. They would say the same thing I saw elsewhere. And it's going to be the same thing in the Ray January, Matthew Smith. It's when I see somebody say something, and then I either find evidence in a document or find evidence in another source when I wasn't looking for it. I'm always concerned when I find what I'm looking for. It's when I find something that I didn't even expect to show up there. Oh, wait a minute. And I'll give you an example. So I'll telegraph. You guys are the only ones that are going to hear this at the moment. And this has to do with Ray January and Matthew Smith and Mrs. Luce and Mr. Pauly. And an interesting thing is that in her testimony, Mrs. Luce told the FBI, told the Warren Commission, that the Cuban exile boat team that she sponsored, when one of them called her after the assassination, told her that they knew Oswald. They had been in and around Oswald. They knew certain things about Oswald. Now, at the time this person called her, nobody knew that stuff about Oswald unless you really had been around. So this is real, okay? And then he also says, yes, and we tried to warn people that Oswald was really dangerous and he could shoot the president, or he could shoot the governor, or he was a loose cannon, he could shoot anybody. Now, where have you heard that, something close to that sentence before? Look at the Sylvia Odio visit and the phone call afterwards. And look at the wording that they expressed to her on the, not in Oswald's presence, but afterwards, where they told Mrs. Luce the same thing they told Sylvia Odio.
Larry, I've got a couple of questions that have come through. One from Gary. I'm going to come to you first, Gary, and then Pete's got a question as well. But Gary, first of all, yourself.
Yeah, Larry, if I heard you correctly, you think that Oswald was likely in Houston or Dallas
Correct.
when he's others place him in Mexico City on September 25th or so. Does that give Nagel's scenario of the end of September assassination attempt any more credence or legs?
No, I don't think it gives, and somebody, I'm glad you asked me that, because I expected somebody to say, you wrote so much about Nagel, and someone would have thought, why is he missing from Tipping Point? Okay. No, I don't think it, I think that there's just a lot of confusion about the date of the Odio visit. That's certainly not firm in my mind. There are reports of Oswald in Houston, independent reports of him talking to people, making phone calls. I'm trying to be specific on whether or he was or was not at Odio's based on the date. I'm just not comfortable with. However, what I am comfortable with is the fact that Nagel could have not known anything about Oswald's activities after Nagel essentially fled from New Orleans. And at that point in time, what Nagel did know is that Oswald was planning to go back east, and something that was scheduled back east. And we have 2 points of confirmation for that, one of which hardly gets, we have Oswald's own letters to CPUSA and us to SWP about his move. We have a witness who described to a researcher him talking about his move. But more importantly, we have one of the first FBI/Secret Service interviews with Marina, asking her about Oswald's trip to the East Coast. So Nagel, I think there's verification of Nagel knowing that Oswald was thinking about going to the East Coast. But I frankly can't see how Nagel could have known anything after that. He could have known about the people that Oswald was talking to in New Orleans, and I think he did. I think he told us something real that he knew about the people he was talking to, the Cubans who were misrepresenting themselves. But I have to take him out of the story after that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Pete.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Larry.
Hi, Pete.
Pete Meller. Yeah. Well, you said earlier, which was pretty cool, that because I was at Lancer in 2003 when someone would have thought was in binder form, and I got you to sign that. So I'm glad to hear it's something of a collector's piece. But I followed that up. I followed your work. I've got the 2006 hardback. Followed that up with Nexus and Tipping Point, and it's all very, very persuasive to me. My question, though, is to do with Mexico City, unfortunately, which Bill Simpich sort of describes as a swamp. I've looked at Albert Osborne, and he denies he traveled with a Hispanic guy on the Red Arrow bus to Mexico City. Yet we've got the McFarlanes, Dr. and Mrs. McFarlane, who were more or less sat with, or say they were sat with, Oswald and Osborne, and also two other English speaking, the Australian girls, Pamela Mumford and Patricia Winston, who spoke or say they claim they had a conversation with Oswald. It's probably a bit left field from what you what you deal with, but working with someone like
Okay.
Bill.
Sure. And that's why I was conditional in my response to Bart. There are a couple of other things we also have, and it's kind of gotten lost over time. But early on, within the first 90 days, there was a press statement, an interview with a Border Patrol security person who reported that Oswald had indeed crossed the border into Mexico. And not only that, they had been asked to monitor his crossing of the border, and that they had done so. He shows up, never heard from again. I am not adverse at all to the thought that Oswald went to Mexico for some time, for some place, for some purpose. What I can no longer believe is his reported experiences inside the embassy, and either embassy. I do think there are good arguments to be made that some of the paperwork that the FBI came up with is questionable. So that's where I have the problem. And like I just said, I'm not convinced that any of the dates relating to the ODO visit are that solid. So in my own mind, I'm not adverse to it, thinking that Oswald might have been in Mexico. I'm just adverse to the official story about Mexico City and the embassies.
Sure, yeah. But otherwise, CIA would have had photographs of the guy.
See, and that's the other thing, again, where I have to jump in and say, if that whole thing, the whole visit of Mexico City, had been to frame Oswald, this has been some kind of a sanctioned CIA operation or a Phillips CIA operation, frame Oswald as being in contact with the Cubans, to being contracted to kill Kennedy. I mean, come on, they would have done a far better job. We'd have pictures, we'd have tape recordings, they had the embassy tapped. That would have all been put into play.
Yeah,
And we
sure.
can't even come up with a stupid photo, and Phillips says the stupidest piece of paper I've ever seen in the whole world is the report that Phillips endorses and the chief of station endorses, that says, oh yeah, we have this informant who, by the way, we know to be Nicaraguan intelligence, but we're not going to tell you that, who claims to have observed him in the Cuban embassy and closely in a public space, heard him talking about killing Kennedy and saw him taking money for it. I mean, like, how any CIA officer could even sign a piece of paper like that without, this is too stupid. That had to be, we're covering our rear about something.
But that's very similar to what the DPD did in the way they basically put things forward and put things in Oswald's mouth and said that he'd done as such. I mean, across the board, tactic is pretty much the same and similar as such. There is no real evidence to nail Oswald down as a sixth-floor shooter at all. So they finger him by making it up. Same as Mexico City.
Which really took me back to the first part of this presentation. I just reached the point where I can't take any of that. It doesn't play. People that are smart and professional, and that even as the Dallas police, I mean, they did know how to do some police work. So I will tell you this, again, this is history of Bloom. When I met with Tom Aliea, and Tom Aliea said, I was there. I watched them screw up photographing the crime scene in the school book depository. I watched Fritz throw down those shells. I watched this all, and Tom's aggravated about that. I mean, he was mad. It's like they were so stupid they had to retake all those photos of the boxes on Saturday because they moved them and they tore up the crime scene. So he's animated about that. So he's telling me, oh, like Tom, so I really can't trust anything the police offered in evidence. And he just kind of looks at me, and then he said, but of course Oswald was the lone shooter. It's kind of like, Tom, you just told me you can't trust anything the police did, and now you're telling me you believe everything else they did.
Yeah.
My mind just goes away and leaves at some point.
How far away does he live from you? He lives in your neck of the woods, doesn't he?
He lives in Tulsa, and I knew people that were in communications with him up until maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I still don't know if he's still living, but I did. Yeah, actually, Connie knew him, and Connie and I had a lengthy discussions with Tom. That was so long ago.
Did you take that? Do you have anything on there written down, or?
It was written down, and then he I bought lunch, and he sold me copies of his 3 newsletters. So I have copies of his newsletter, which his newsletters were basically 2 things. They proved everything that the police crime scene unit had done was wrong and faked, and that everything JFK researchers were doing was wrong and faked. And it's like, okay, so this just all cancels out, right? But no, I don't have any no, sorry.
Too bad.
I would say I was young and innocent then, but I was
Aren't
younger.
we all? Aren't we all?
Okay,
I thought it was a great presentation.
yeah,
Thank you.
terrific. I'm just going to stop the recording here, Larry, but I want to thank you for a terrific presentation. There's a really good feedback on it. Very interesting. We may well continue after the recording stops, but I'm just going to stop the recording here with a thank you very much indeed, Larry.
I appreciate it.